always.
Uganda, strategically located in the heart of Eastern Africa, is rich with oil and mineral resources. The National Development Plan 3 recognizes oil and minerals as some of the sectors with the greatest multiplier effect on the economy. As the country looks towards the oil development phase, north of $15 billion worth of investment, the mineral sector too is undergoing a complete makeover. For the journey, opportunities, linkages, challenges, and readiness for development of these two subsectors, stay tuned to NBS TV from the 26th of August to the 26th of November for the 90 days of Uganda's oil and mining. Brought to you by Uganda Chamber of Mines and Petroleum in partnership with Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development. Supported by
welcome to day 73 of the Uganda Chamber of Mines and Petroleum 90 Days of Oil and Mining Campaign. My name is Ashaba Aggrey, and I'll be your host and moderator today to explore this talk show for the next 2 hours that will be tackling the optimization of local content and finding ways in how Ugandans can be able to tackle this big elephant. And with me in the studio, I'll be joined by 4 super panelists. Mr. Jeff Baitwa, who is our treasurer at the Uganda Chamber of Mines and Petroleum, but is also the MD of Bro Group. I'll also be joined by Mr. Peter Muliisa, who is the Chief Legal and Corporate Affairs Manager for the Petroleum Authority of Uganda. These are the regulators of the industry of oil and gas in the country. And I will also be joined by Ms. Betty Namubiru, who is the National Content Manager at the Petroleum Authority of Uganda, and Ms. Jackie Lwanga, who is the HSE Manager of the ICS Global. Just a quick correction, Mr. Peter Muliisa is from the Uganda National Oil Company. So, and that is the company that will be commercializing Ugandan interests in the oil and gas sector. Briefly, during the exploration phase of oil and gas, there was about $3 billion that was spent, and out of that, almost 28% was retained as in-country value by Ugandan companies, by Ugandans achieving employment and doing supplies of goods and services. However, in the next phase, which probably will happen sometime next year, if FID is taken by the end of this year, will be in excess of about $15 billion for the different projects, as the panelists will be briefing us. And we are saying that as a country, how are we preparing ourselves as Ugandans for employment in the employment environment? How are the companies upscaling themselves? How are the companies preparing themselves to partake of this opportunity? And is it possible, for example, since during exploration we did about 28% of this value that was retained in country, is it a possibility that we can retain at least 50% of the 15 billion in country? Me and the panelists will be able to explore this perspective, and they will be able to brief us and see how important and probably how best it could benefit the country. Because as you're very well aware, Uganda has one of the biggest young populations. Median age is about 17 years. About 75% of the Ugandans are below the age of 35. Young men and women who are looking for decent health care, better housing, better quality of life, and good employment. So with me here today, I have Jeff, Peter, Jackie, and Betty, who will be able to expertly tell us how the country can prepare itself, how young men and women can be able to position themselves to take up some of these employment opportunities, but also how they can eventually link into other sectors at the end of the phases of development so that they can continuously create more value for the country. Allow me to start off by inviting Peter. Peter, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you, and good afternoon to viewers and NBS.
Peter is a seasoned legal person who is highly educated in the legal space, but is also in charge of most of the negotiations that have been going on between Uganda and the different oil companies. And I'd like to put to you, Peter, as we start off, as we dive in right away, that UNOC, Uganda National Oil Company, as a public company that has the mandate to commercialize interests of Uganda, how are you as UNOC planning to support national or local content as a driver of economic transformation?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, viewers. Permit me, before I answer your question, to pass on my condolences to the NBS family and my brother Kin for the loss of Dr. Kalisa. It was a sad week, and please accept my condolences. Moving to the question, I think it's best to look at generally what the government of Uganda has done and how UNOC plays in that space. And to start with, the participation of Ugandans and Ugandan companies has been given serious attention from a planning perspective, from a policy perspective, and now we are at implementation of those policies that have been put in place after extensive period of research, period of benchmarking by the government. And so we have a policy in place and laws in place now that give priority for supply of goods and services to Ugandans and Ugandan companies. And some services and goods, as we'll be highlighting in the show, have been ring-fenced for Ugandans and Ugandan companies to supply. There's also been public-private preparation of companies to participate in these tenders and to empower them, to prepare them, to ensure that companies are able, resourced, and can participate fully in the bids that will come. Our law is robust on national content, and I'll probably detail out a few things as we go along on how our law aids Ugandan companies and Ugandans to participate and to win tenders. But coming to the space of UNOC, part of our work is to sit with the oil companies in the normal meetings, commercial, to agree on work programs and budget, to agree on how to plan and to deliver these projects. So our input is, first of all, to look at how we implement the law as joint venture partners. The law that requires that Ugandans, Ugandan goods, Ugandan services are given a priority. So that is the first space that we are playing in, sitting with the joint venture partners, Total, UNOC, and Talo before it finalizes its divestiture. And we look at the law, look at the level of compliance that we are taking as joint venture partners to the law. We look at how to empower and inform companies and stakeholders to participate in the sector. And this is done through meetings, engagements with stakeholders. We have quarterly engagements that are focused on national content as joint venture partners. Then through the bidding processes that are led by the operators for the upstream, in this case, Telenga, Total, and Kingfisher, led by UNOC. So we review what the contracting process looks like and whether we are complying with the laws and whether we are encouraging Ugandan companies and parties to participate. And that is the space that we play on the JVP side. Now, coming to UNOC internal as a company, what are we doing? We are participating in ensuring that we empower Ugandans. You might have seen that we signed an MOU with Stanbic to support the Stanbic incubator that trains and empowers businesses to participate. Internally, we have a national content policy. We have a national content resource teams that ensure that all our procurements focus on ensuring that Ugandans are empowered and are encouraged to participate. So in brief, that's what we are doing as a company. We believe that we are going to achieve a significantly higher level of participation as Ugandans in the phase of development and production than it were in exploration. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That's very good of you. I hope that when you actually start on the operational phase, the developmental phase, will be able to partake of some of the opportunities that also UNOC as an entity brings to Ugandan businesses and Ugandan employees. Straight to Jeff. Jeff here is our treasurer, but is also the director for the Bro Group, but is probably arguably one of also the biggest beneficiaries of the oil and gas sector during the exploration phase. And I'd like to put to him, based on his experience during exploration, how does he see whether Ugandan businesses have been empowered to retain this value, especially the fact that we are going into a much more robust and bigger budget lines in terms of the investments that are coming into the sector, and how is the information being disseminated? And based on your own experiences, do you think Ugandan companies are actually ready to partake of these opportunities?
Thank you very much, Moderator. Good afternoon to our viewers. If I may get you, in terms of the companies being able to participate, a lot will be dependent on so many factors. And obviously, the key of these factors is the ability for the companies to deliver the projects that they intend to bid for. We have an opportunity. Many firms from Uganda should be able to participate. And you see, when we talk about Ugandan companies here, we are talking about all companies registered and incorporated in Uganda. So I am without a doubt that we'll have many companies locally participating. How, to what extent will indigenous players participate? That we will see on its own. So if you look at the information flow, I think the petroleum companies, including the Chamber of Mines and Petroleum and many other stakeholders, they've tried their level best to try and reach out to players with what's possibly, by availing them the information of what will be coming up in due course. Information gathering is dependent on two things. Either you seek for it or there are other avenues. You wait for the right avenues through which this information can reach you. So I am confident that to an extent, many people have a lot of information with regards to what's coming up. So that's not a problem. My only concern will be on how ready are we? Because it's been such a long time from exploration to now. We waited over, probably it's now coming to 8 years, which is quite unique, but it has happened for reasons. And what I know from my last experience, a number of farms that participated then have folded since then. These were, let's say, that I would call them the guys who went in fast during exploration. And why have they folded? Obviously, the lack of business continuity because of the delay in the transition. Many of them prepared themselves, invested accordingly, and had a lot of investment lying there idle for many years, for which they had to pay for, and the banks could not wait, or they could not just find income, revenue streams to sustain themselves.
Thank you.
So I'm likely, personally, I think there will be a new landscape of participants, and the danger is many of the new participants may not have the experience from the previous cycle, because to deliver, you require a number of things. One, you require the investment or the capital. You require the resources, basically. The resources include access to finance, people, systems, organizational structures, and you'll also require kind of goodwill. And goodwill could emerge from various things. Goodwill is past record, could be relationships, it could be something else. So in this new phase coming up, I am quite fearful that many of the old players who took the initial risk in this industry will be left out. So we'll have new players who will have to go through a learning curve. And with that, again, that could cause a lot of stress or pressure to the various participants. But let's not be pessimistic. We remain optimistic. So I strongly believe we'll have a fair share.
Thank you, Jeff, for that preamble, but also to strongly put out that the delays have actually affected businesses and some have actually folded. And hopefully that this time round, when the decisions are done, we will make sure that we prepare better, stopped this process from unfolding in a systematic manner, can be things of the past, so businesses can continue to create value, but also create employment for Ugandans. Allow me to bring in Jackie. Knowing how oil and gas is highly standardized, and knowing that it's very difficult because the barriers to entry for the oil and gas sector is basically much higher than any traditional industry. From your experience, how ready and how best can Ugandans adopt international best practices and standards in their daily lives to be able to participate and partake of this huge elephant that we have in front of us?
Okay, thank you very much, Moderator, and good afternoon, viewers. I'll start by emphasizing that it's a voluntary decision to implement, to develop and implement these standards. Having said that, these standards are the gateway to the oil and gas sector because they are a requirement and non-negotiable requirements. So, organizations make a decision based on their strategic direction on implementing these standards so that they can get into oil and gas. Now, I can't tell whether we are ready or not because we really do not know what people have on ground because all organizations have their own systems, they have their norms, their ways of working. And, whether it's informally or formally, they do have systems in place. So, for example, procurement, one organization, when they go to procure maybe 10 fire extinguishers, they'll tell the MD, we need 10 fire extinguishers. He'll either give them cash or send mobile money. They'll go procure the fire extinguishers, bring back the receipt, end of transaction. Whereas another organization will, have a robust system in place. They'll get 3 suppliers for the fire extinguishers. They'll evaluate them. They'll put them on the approved supplier list. They will get 3 quotations. They will decide to go with the one with the best value for money. They'll request to see samples. They'll issue an LPO. The extinguishers will be delivered with a delivery note. They will sign to say that they received them as requested. And then they will invoice and the payment will be sent to the bank. So it's hard to tell who is where, who has what, unless people, or organizations clearly understand the requirements and check to see where they are vis-a-vis the requirements. So, they'll need to, first of all, do a gap analysis and identify where they are. People might be surprised that they actually have systems that meet international standards or that they're partially compliant or fully compliant, probably not compliant at all, but at least that forms basis for them to plan on how to go ahead, So you can't really tell who is ready unless they start with the gap analysis and then make a plan where they're falling short to implement.
Thank you, Jackie. I think you heard it from the expert, is that we need to check ourselves and see whether we are up to speed in terms of standards and the best practices for us to be able to partake of the opportunity. I'd like to bring in at this point Madam Betty Namubiru, who is the National Content Manager for the Petroleum Authority of Uganda. The Petroleum Authority of Uganda, as she will tell you, is the regulator of this industry, and it's one of the drivers of national content, but also standards, environment, employment, and everything else to make sure that Uganda actually benefits from its resources. Betty, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and thank you, viewers.
As a regulator, what frameworks or under what frameworks do you buttress this conversation around national content or local content, as most people know it?
Thank you, Aggrey, and thank you for the good introduction about what the Petroleum Authority of Uganda does, which is majorly to regulate and monitor the sector activities. In terms of national content, I would say that this country has a very comprehensive legal framework that talks about different aspects on how the sector should be managed. And within that comprehensive legal framework, we have national participation. The promotion and advocacy for national participation, looking at 5 major pillars. Employment of Ugandans. What is it that we need to do to ensure that Ugandans get jobs in this sector? This is captured in the legal framework. The aspects to do with supply of goods and services or utilization of Ugandan goods and services is one other fact that actually ties in well as we talk about value retention, which is the theme of this discussion. Aspects to do with enterprise development, getting the companies competitive to supply beyond the boundaries of the country, getting the companies to embrace the international certifications, the international nature of this industry, doing things beyond the normal, beyond the ordinary. Aspects to do with technology transfer. This is a new sector in the country. There is a lot that we need to do to embrace the new technologies. I can give you an example. We probably have a number of civil engineering companies that have done all the high-rise buildings that we've seen in Kampala. But then there is another aspect that one needs to have as a company to be able to comply with to go into this. So to begin with, just defining that alone is coming from the regulations. We have a very strong legislative framework that clearly highlights how these issues have to be undertaken, and a number of tools have been put into place to ensure that we actually achieve this. When we talk about employment, what is it that, how can people actually know that there are opportunities that exist in the sector? A number of frameworks have been put in place, including the National the National Oil and Gas Talent Register. When you talk about the contracts, we have the National Supplier Database, where people know that if I have to supply the sector, I should go and register there. Quite a number of initiatives. There are also several other initiatives done by private sector, including Chamber of Mines, the different information dissemination, engagements that are happening around. So this is the whole approach that we are looking at, but it is majorly informed by the comprehensive legislative framework that we have in place.
Thank you, Betty. Probably I'll come back to you to ask about the issue that Jeff raised on what a Ugandan company is and also around succession planning, but at a later stage. But allow me to go back to Peter, because UNOC, as we had discussed already, is the entity tasked by the government to take care of the commercial interests of the country. And we know that UNOC's mandate spreads across the entire petroleum value chain, from about 15% of the crude oil reserves, 15% in the pipeline, and about 40% in the refinery, including the derivatives industry. As UNOC, how important are all these value chains in how Ugandans can become major petroleum players across just within the region, but globally?
Thank you, Aggrey. And I think when I look at value retention, it's wider than creating opportunities and jobs. Yeah. It's about the impact this industry will have on this country, on the growth of this country, on the industrialization agenda of this country. And that's why the way the government has structured the commercialization plan for the industry is to ensure that there is significant support to the industrialization agenda of the country. And how are we doing this? So we have the upstream sector, Lwanga and Kingfisher, and we'll be producing at peak period about 240,000 barrels of crude per day. And so ordinarily it would be easy to say, let's ship all of it and sell it, get money, construct roads, create employment, and that's it. But you lose a bit of value if you send all of it and sell it to the international market. So what this government decided to do was to commercialize this crude oil in two ways. One, to transport part of it and sell it to the international market, but to retain a portion, 60,000 barrels per day, to be refined in a refinery here that's going to be constructed in Kabale. And around that refinery, create an industrial park that we are also managing as a Uganda National Company. That industrial park, we call it Kabale Industrial Park, and it's petrochem based. And why do we need these? These two infrastructure pieces of infrastructure. One, we spend about $1.2 billion annually in oil imports, in petroleum products imports. So if you are able to reduce that and have part of that money spent here in buying refined products internally from a refinery, you improve your balance of trade, you improve your balance of payment. And that's how an economy grows. But refineries do not just produce petroleum products that we use in our cars, the common ones, petrol, diesel, and kerosene. They produce other materials that can be used to create value. And so what we've structured is that these other materials will be feedstock to a petrochemical-based industry around the refinery. And how does that create value? Because we've looked at a baseline survey, we've looked at how many jobs will be created, how much value can be retained in terms of people serving these entities, providing services to these entities and getting money. And we've looked at probably 130,000, 60,000 jobs to be created, supply chains to be created, and this value retention. But beyond that, can we do import substitution industries? And that's what we're going to do in the Kabale Industrial Park. I actually think that the biggest component of value retention is going to be in the refinery and the Kabale Industrial Park, because petrochemical industries will establish in this park. They will create jobs. They will produce products that we are importing today and probably exceed the supply requirements here, the demand requirements here, and we'll be able to export, and that will improve our balance of trade. Balance of trade and payment. We are currently doing a macroeconomic impact study of this industrial park and the refinery on the economy, and we'll be able to give you the numbers, and we believe they are going to be very good. So how does this help? For instance, we will have the ability to produce fertilizers, plastics, and so many products that come out of petrochemical industries. But let me just focus on fertilizers and look at the impact fertilizers would have on our agriculture. So oil and gas should be able to spur other industries so that 20 years from today, you're not looking at oil and gas as the biggest revenue source for the country. No, it should have created sufficient push for the other sectors so that the other sectors are the biggest contributors to GDP. And I'll give you one example of a country I visited probably 10 years ago, Indonesia. Indonesia has been producing oil and gas for a while. But at the time I visited, Indonesia was producing about 800,000 barrels of crude per day. Their daily demand then was 1.1 million barrels per day as a country, their consumption as a country. But when we looked at their GDP contributors, oil and gas was not even number 3. Their biggest GDP contributor was manufacturing. So what we hope this industry will do through Kabale Industrial Park, through the refinery, is to create that industrialization so that in the future we are looking at these industries as the biggest contributors to our GDP, as opposed to us relying on revenues of crude and crude oil. So that's how we see the value chain working together. And as UNOC, we have an additional project that is Kampala Storage Terminal that will be looking at putting up a terminal for petroleum products that is big enough to improve our security of supply. Currently, as a country, we have a real risk on security of supply, that we do not have more than 20 days stock of petroleum products as a country. And that's risky. So once we have this storage terminal in place, it's connected to the refinery, you improve security of supply, and probably that should push businesses and make doing business a lot cheaper. So looking at the complete value chain, it's really, I think, we're in a place where we can confidently say that we are going to retain significant value and push this economy beyond reliance on the revenues that we'll be looking at getting from oil and gas.
Thank you, Peter, for that very comprehensive brief. But I also like the fact that you speak about oil and gas not just being what we put in vehicles, but the different linkages to the rest of the other industries, pharmaceuticals, petroleum industry, rather even for bitumen, for road construction, the many things that come out of the refining process that will support the country in doing the other things that ordinarily they would have to import. So speaking of that, I want to go back to Betty first, because you have about 8 to 10 billion going into the development of the fields. Then you have about 3.5 on the pipeline and about 4 billion for the refinery. What are the opportunities in these three projects, and how do Ugandans, or how are Ugandans will be benefiting?
Okay. Thank you very much. Indeed, the aggregated total that we expect in terms of investment is about 15 billion US dollars. And that is coming through the development of the different facilities that are going to support production. We look at aspects like, first of all, to break down what these are. Like the construction of the central processing facilities. Those are just facilities that are going to support bringing oil up and, going into other phases to be able to, come on stream. This is going to involve a lot of steel works. The steel is going to come from maybe outside the country. We are looking at over maybe 4 million tons of equipment and materials that will be coming in. Besides that, there is another part of the construction, the usual construction materials, the cement, gravel, sand, and everything that goes into the construction process. So looking at a local company here, besides the steel that may not be available, and it is not that all the steel will come from outside, they have done a categorization of what kind of steel is available in the country and what will come on. So what that means is that in terms of that specific construction, there is a lot of building and construction material that will go in there, and that provides an opportunity for a Ugandan company that is prepared to supply. When we go to construction of the refinery, construction of the storage facilities, it is still the basic construction. All we know is that there's going to be that professional requirement of maybe consulting firms to support the understanding of the designs, the interpretation for the rest of the people that will be doing this work. But all that presents opportunities. In terms of environmental studies, we all know that all the work that we do begins with the impact assessments. This is work that Ugandans can do. In terms of transportation, transporting people that are going to do this work, we think at the peak of the projects we'll have no less than 1 million people in the Albertine Graben, in addition to the people that are already there. So there are lots of opportunities in terms of transporting these people from where they will be staying to the construction of these facilities. There are opportunities in terms of the food that these people will be taking. Peter has talked about the linkages. There is a lot that we are going to see in terms of vibrancy of the agriculture sector as a result of the work that will be going in there. There are also other aspects like supply of office materials, catering, a whole range of services that are happening in other sectors. So all we need to do now is to think about this investment. First of all, it is going to be the very first biggest investment that this country has seen. We've seen projects that have gone up to maybe 8 million, 100 million, but this is a 15 billion US dollar investment. So there is a lot of opportunity. When you look at where we've come from, the exploration and appraisal phase, we had an investment of up to 3.5 billion US dollars, and out of that, about 900 million was retained in the country through working with Ugandan companies. So if you look at that magnitude, I mean the 900 that we are able to retain during the exploration phase, and you compare it to the development phase. And the beauty about this is that at least going into the development phase, we are not where we are previously when the sector just come in. I can tell you that private sector has done a lot where we started from, it was going into provision of drivers, catering, these very basic services. But we have seen Ugandan companies trying to improve their systems, and they have offered services up to, geological studies, which were considered to be highly technical. We are seeing joint ventures in the procurement and construction management services. We have seen Ugandan companies participate in the front-end engineering designs. So it is a whole range of services, but it requires adequate preparation. I speak about the tools that we have to support this. But on the other hand, as the enterprises, the local firms, we still have to make sure that we prepare. We go into the joint ventures to be able to find the right partners and try and be able to supply the sector.
Thank you, Betty. Before we go for a break, I'd like to bring it back to Jeff, who's been part of the business and who has been there since the explorations phase started. And I'd just like to ask Jeff, currently or based on your experience, do you think that the contracting and procurement process is transparent enough to allow as many Ugandans as possible to be able to partake of this opportunity? You have 5 minutes before we take a break.
That's a difficult one, but whatever I say will be basically based on my opinion.
Exactly.
So I'm not speaking on behalf of the rest. But from my experience, to a large extent, the procurement process is transparent. You can respond. Many times you respond, you lack a few things or many things, you get disqualified. If you're you got the next phase, which is being assessed or evaluated. Evaluation could range from technical, commercial, and ABCD. Obviously, they will not open your commercial proposal until you qualify technically or you meet the minimum mark. So from my last experience, I think we had, I wouldn't say, what can I say, maybe we were not so many, but we were able to get to that point where we were evaluated to technically, and we passed. I don't know what the minimum mark was, but we got it. And they opened our commercial bids. Then we were approached. We had what you'd call contract negotiations or clarification meetings, and finally we won the contracts. So that's from my experience. I don't know how the rest have fared along the lines. So, but again, contracts or procurement is procurement. There's always a hand or invisible hand of a human being. So you never know. Sometimes some of these procurements got bogged down by some of these elements. They could be favoritism, they could be, because there's human element inside here. So some bids may not go, or some procurement may not go as expected because of that element. But to a large extent, from what I've seen from my side, looking at the logistics, I can say it meets the requirement. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff. We're going to tell us what the basic standards or barriers to entry to the sector are, and what would be those standards that one would need to play in the oil and gas business. So, for employment, or it's a business that is seeking to get an opportunity in the sector that is demanded by oil and gas industry.
Okay, thank you very much. Aggrey. For any organization, you'll at least need a quality management system. You know, you'd like to give a quality service to your customers, or a quality product to your customers at the end of the day. But in addition to that, no matter what sector you're in, whether it's logistics or construction, you also need to have a health and safety management system to make sure that your employees or contractors are not taken ill or injured while at work, your assets are protected, and an environmental management system as well to protect the environment. Now, these are not really barriers. Okay, like I said, standards are voluntary. And organizations would be surprised that they already have these standards because if you conduct a risk assessment for every task, process, or activity, then you'll have the records and you'll be able to take action. If you have safe systems of work developed and implemented, if you've prepared for emergencies, you conduct, drills to rehearse and see if the plan will work for you, you're already there. When things go wrong, if you investigate incidents and take action to prevent them reoccurring, this is what makes up a standard. It is very hard to drive the standards or to implement the standards in an organization without top management commitment and support. So they've got to drive these standards. And if it becomes the way organizations work, and not having a standard which works parallel to what actually happens in the organization, then you already have a standard in your organization working. Consistency is also key to these standards. If you say you'll inspect your vehicles prior to mobilization, please let it be consistent. Do it all the time and maintain the records. If you're going to induct your workers, let it be consistent again. I know many organizations actually do have to tell whether, they meet international standards because they're not certified. So until you bring in a third party, an accreditation body to check to audit you and see if your standards do meet international, requirements, then, because you can't prove to anybody that you have a standard that meets international requirements. But once it's certified, then that's the cherry on the cake. Now, all this that I'm mentioning is what will be required at the time of bidding. The previous speaker said, when he was being asked if it's fair, during the bidding process, and he said, they look at the technical side and then your commercial side. Before all that, they look at the standards. Do you have any standards in place? Then attach all that documentation, attach the records, the proof that you do what you said you're doing. In addition to that, attach the certificate to show that your system is actually certified. And it is actually not as hard as people may think it is. It's consistently doing what you're supposed to do. You've got to change the culture, the mindset in an organization so that they all know that this is how we work around here. This is how we do things around here. And you're consistently following what you say you'll be doing. So if you do all that, you have the quality management system, health and safety management system, and environmental management system. In addition to the sector-specific standards, like for logistics, you have the AEO standards that you've got to follow. The lifting equipment operators, they've got the LEA standards. So these are in addition to the 3 standards that I've mentioned, which are required by any organization. So, once people implement them, you're able to meet the requirements for the standards at the time of bidding.
Thank you, Jackie. That as Ugandans, we need to start doing things the correct way.
Yes.
And then, which brings me now to Betty again, to say that based on the studies that have been done, both by the oil companies, the baseline survey and what PAU has done, and even the government of Uganda, and the capacity assessment that they have done on Ugandan businesses and individuals. What plans are in place to support enterprise development, to support succession planning for Ugandans to be able to get to the level required by oil and gas?
All right, thank you very much. As PAU regarding enterprise development, the bigger picture or the overall approach that we are looking at is to establish an industry enhancement center. That was a recommendation of the industry baseline survey, where we can take companies through incubation to appreciate aspects that Jack has been talking about, HSE principles, to know that we are supposed to have a documented management system, to know that how do I respond to a bid of this nature, of this magnitude, if I am faced with a contract, what do I have to do before I even rush to sign off this contract? So this is the center where we think these things are going to happen, and that is in the long run. However, to begin with now, what we are doing is we are promoting the registration on the National Supplier Database, like I earlier said, because it's the first prerequisite for one to supply the industry. We are promoting together with the IOCs, and we think it's going to even be bigger when the EPC contractors are announced, because these are the ones that will be doing the work. Promotion of joint ventures. If there is an aspect of your work, if you are, say, you're into logistics, and there are aspects that you can't deliver on, how do you get to work with a global experienced firm to deliver on this aspect? There is a lot that is going into the discussion of the joint ventures. We are looking into coming up with guidelines to guide on how these will come through. Another aspect is information dissemination. We believe information is power, and it has been embraced over the years. Getting the Ugandan companies, but also the individuals, to appreciate this sector, to know that, well, I have been into the construction industry for 20 plus years, but when it comes to oil and gas, this is what I need to do. So that information has been disseminated in different forums. The IOCs have quarterly supplier development engagements, and these are going to continue, where they give feedback to a detail as far as why Ugandan companies were not able to beat the requirements to get certain tenders. PAU is also running, we have a comprehensive communication strategy that allows us the freedom to speak to the population, to the different people about the different aspects in the sector, how it's evolving. We are always in the Albertine Graben on the different radio stations. That is structured within our communication strategy. We are also leveraging on the private sector, like Chamber of Mines and Petroleum. There are a number of engagements that happen every year that are known. So all these mechanisms are trying to break down, to bring down to an understanding what the oil and gas sector is. We have taken it a step higher to ensure that whenever there is an upcoming opportunity, if there is a tender, we do publish this on the PAU website. We look at the procurement plans of these companies, we agree on them, they get approved through the normal procedures, and we update this on our website. The reason for this is for a Ugandan company that is preparing to supply to have a view of what is coming in future so that they can be able to prepare. So in terms of the mechanisms for enterprise development, PAU is working, Ministry of Energy is also doing some work. The different private sector bodies, Stanbic Bank through the incubator, they are doing a lot of preparation of these companies. So it is a lot of work that is going into this, but also the other thing I have to emphasize here, the aspect of the companies themselves. You can have these tools. We can sit in these engagements and speak to the companies, but it is very important for the companies to embrace this information. This sector is knowledge-based, like we always say. So we need to make sure that we move along to understand where we are. We are going into the development and construction. What does it require? What are the contracts that are in there? All this information is now available. So no one is not able to know, what is going on in the sector. What I can urge the companies is that the coming stage is bringing on a set of players. Initially, we've had the IOCs or the licensed companies, let me say, running the show, being the clients, the ones that, run the tenders and we respond. But the next set is going to be for the contractors. The contractors are coming. Yes, as Ugandans, we might have missed taking the contracts for, say, EPC and all these things. But there is a lot that is in there in terms of subcontracting. If any EPC contractor comes here to do the engineering, procurement, and construction, they will still need someone to supply them with the office, stationery and all these things. They'll need someone to do the manpower supply services. So there's a lot that is coming up as we put in place measures to ensure that the enterprises build their competitiveness. It also goes back to the companies to ensure that they get to understand the sector, to speak to the different suppliers, the global suppliers. We have the national supplier database. I'll keep coming back to that. We publish it on the PAU website. One is able to visit the PAU website and know, what do I do? I am in camp management. Those are the services I prepare. Is there anyone that does maintenance in that area? Can I speak to them so that we put up a tender that is backed by experience, that we are able to pull the finances required, but also the policies and procedures that are required. So preparation is going to be a gradual process. We cannot wake up one day and say, here we are, as Ugandans, we have the capacity. I can tell you today, at least we have a fair view of where Ugandans have the capacity, and as a regulator, at least in our discussion, we cannot let some of those services go to foreign companies. A big example here is the ring-fenced services within the regulations. The 16 category of services, at least those are the other side. Then we are also publishing, PAU is publishing a book on Ugandan companies that have supplied the sector. And this is meant to further give visibility, because where we are at the moment, the National Supplier Database registers everyone. But at least in this book, we will know that in terms of logistics, we've had A, B, C, D, names of companies, their physical address, and what have you. We are even contemplating on whether to indicate the magnitude of the contracts they have been able to execute, so that the contractor coming, first of all, knows there is the National Supplier Database where I'm going to hire from, but there is also this book that tells me that this company has been able to supply in this category of services. And then again to know, my contract is this big, but what is the magnitude in terms of the range? So the obligation on building capacity falls on, yes, the regulator, but also as the companies, we have some work to do.
Thank you, Betty. And I think you bring out a good point, and that is the point of Ugandan companies. And I'd like to go to our legal expert, Peter. Yes. There's been obviously a question on what makes a Ugandan company, and what is it in the laws of the land that support what you would call Ugandan company. Jeff referred to indigenous company. Can you please help to paint a broader picture of what a Ugandan company is? Is it those that are registered in the country, those owned by Ugandans, and what does the law say?
Thank you, Aggrey. And I think just if I could just permit me a minute to sort of summarize the conversation that is panning out here, for somebody to get to easily understand what we're talking about. When you talk about national content, and you're talking about Ugandans participating, how do we participate? And I think Betty has given a very extensive explanation on how we get in. But we have $15 billion investment that is going to be spent on buying and paying for services and goods. And this money is going to be spent here in a period of about between 3 to 4 years. Now, how do Ugandans participate? What the law has structured is that if you're a Ugandan company, which I'm going to explain in a short while, you must register, first of all, on the National Supplier Database if you intend to supply services. And Betty has explained how the National Supplier Database works. So the first thing to do for one to participate is register. If you have goods or services you intend to supply, be on that database, because then you give the companies and the regulator visibility on your existence and your ability to supply particular services or goods. Now, once you've done that, get information on what is available, what is required, get to these private sector entities like the Stanbic Incubator, get to learn how to prepare your company. What do you need? The standards that Jack was talking about. Make sure that all those are in place. And that's work that can be done, guided by entities that have been in the sector, companies that have been in the sector, like Jeff's company, like Jackie has talked to us. So in Kampala here, you can walk around and find companies that have supplied, and you're able to learn from those companies, to have the standards in place, to have the systems in place so that you're ready for bidding. Do I need to completely change my company, service provision or business orientation to be able to participate in oil and gas? No, because services like catering, freight, clearing and forwarding services, logistics will all be required. So if your company is providing those services, you don't need to recalibrate your business structure and process. You just need to align with the requirements of the sector and participate. So basically that is the way to go. And the way the sector is structured, we have 16 ring-fenced services that Betty has talked about. Those must be provided by Ugandans. So if I was an owner of a company, the first place I would go to is to those 16 services and goods provision, and identify the one that I really want to focus on, because those are ring-fenced for Ugandans. No foreign entity is going to give those services unless there is absolutely no Ugandan company available to provide those services. So look at those services and see how you participate. In terms of evaluation of bids, there is an extra 10% awarded to companies based on the national content structure they have. So you have that 10% advantage. Even on financials, if a national company, if a company with a Ugandan company has quoted a little bit higher in price, maybe by 5%, than an international company, there is consideration to favor the Ugandan company, the Ugandan company, just even though the price is slightly higher. So the regime in place is such that it has created extensive avenues to enable Ugandans to participate. And all we can do now, as we have done, PAU is disseminating information, Chamber of Mines is disseminating information, UNOC is doing that, private sector entities are doing that, is really to rally Ugandan companies and entities and citizens to participate. On that component, before I answer your question, I want to really re-emphasize the point of joint venture partnerships. It's really useful to look for international companies, or even within Ugandan companies, get Ugandan companies to come together so that you bid for bigger components of the work. And Betty will probably explain eventually the point in the industry we call unbundling of contracts, where big contracts are offered, like engineering, procurement, and construction. It's a big component, but it has smaller components that can be taken up by Ugandan companies. So there's a process to unbundle, a requirement for companies to unbundle these contracts into small chunks that Ugandan companies can pick of the bigger contract. So I do believe that the regulatory regime is strong, robust enough. The information dissemination has been done extensively, and it must continue. But Ugandan companies must mobilize themselves and come to participate. Now, concluding this comment, let me just come to what the law says about what a Ugandan company is. And you have the upstream law and the midstream law. But generally, let's say a Ugandan company is deemed to be a company in Uganda. Of course, it must be registered in Uganda, either by incorporation or by registration. But the key thing is that it employs Ugandans. It procures its raw materials or whatever its inputs are in its business within Uganda. It uses Ugandan produced materials. And if it is technology, its technology is present here. So the general discussion around this point has been that it should be a company that is owned by Ugandans. And I think what the policy focus in defining a Ugandan company that way was driven by the fact that if a company is resident in Uganda, it employs Ugandans. It uses materials that are manufactured in Uganda. It uses raw materials that are produced in Uganda. That company is adding value to Uganda than probably a company that may be owned by Ugandans, but is not using Ugandan materials, is not employing Ugandans. So we went for value creation in country by a company to come up with this definition.
Thank you, Peter. That was very comprehensive. I believe it answers that niggling issue that people have had about what a Ugandan entity is, specifically for oil and gas. Which brings me now back to Jeff, and also to borrow from joint venturing. Because when you look at the size of the contracts that are coming through, whether it's from the logistics side, whether it's from the EPC, whether it is from the EPCM, whatever it is, they are quite huge, especially for the Tier 1. What is your view on how Ugandan entities or Ugandan companies can really come together without necessarily playing against each other? They come together, create more synergy, and then they can probably have a more aggressive approach to some of these opportunities.
Yeah, I totally agree. The contract size varies. And Betty mentioned it earlier. During the exploration phase, many small firms are able to have a direct relationship with the oil companies. Because, yes, the level of activity was high in relation or relative to what we knew from before or what we ever encountered. But the phase coming up now is going to be quite huge, without a doubt. So you can understand the oil companies trying to bundle these huge contracts together for contract management purposes and risk. So they try to pass on the risk to another party. And when they pass it on, they pass it on wholesomely. They try and pass it on as wholesomely as they can. So if you're looking at the level of contracting or participation, for us, you're going to be, we're looking at Tier 1, which is most likely to be the EPC or the person who has a direct relationship with the IOC, International Oil Company.
Maybe you need to break down IOC.
So International Oil Company, I mentioned that. So International Oil Companies are the Totals, UNOC. Now, the nature of work that happens at that level is a big package that will involve the engineering, procurement, and construction. So you look at the EPC that will do the CPF, which is your central processing facilities, the drilling EPC, the services EPCs, the nature of work, technology, expertise, competence, risk, is beyond many Ugandan companies. So that will not come to us. That will go to the international players who know themselves and familiar with each other in these activities. Then these guys will now do the next level of contracting, which will be Tier 2. And they'll try and unbundle some of these activities they've taken over. And as they are doing that also, they are passing on the risk to whoever is going to provide the service for them. So now, our subject matter here was how do we retain as much value as possible? Obviously, at the IOC EPC relationship, we don't have that capacity. And those are going to be big packages, 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion. So we are likely to miss out, or we shall definitely miss out at that level. Now, when you come to Tier 2, again, it's not a limited scope. It's quite a huge scope with a risk. So you look at contracts between $20 to $100 million in that magnitude. And those contracts, to execute $20 to $20+ million contract, requires a lot. Organizational-wise, you must meet the standards. Because remember, why are these guys asking you to meet the standards? Because they are passing on the risk to you. And in the process of passing on risk to you, you must be able to show them you can actually take on the risk. So they are very careful because they have signed a back-to-back with the IOC. They also want to sign the same contract that they've signed with the IOC is the same contract they would like you to also inherit in terms of content and other terms. So at that level, yes, some Ugandan companies will be able to participate. But the question is, what is the nature of these Ugandan companies that will participate? And going back to Mr. Muliisa's statement, Mine is not to argue who a Ugandan company is, but I like people to understand the context that any company registered here locally becomes a Ugandan company because it pays its tax, it's employing people, it's doing ABCD, which is fine. So employment will be there, taxation will be facilitated, training and skill development will take place, blah, 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 blah. So if you look from the government side, all those boxes tick in terms of what government is trying to see. But let's move a step further. Now, these companies that will be at tier 2 probably cumulatively would have a potential of making $400 million in profit out of their services. Now, if these companies are, and we cannot stop them, are increasingly foreign-owned, there will be profit repatriation. So this money will leave the economy and go away. So what's my advice? I'm not saying we fight this, but what I'm trying to say is, from the PAU side, she talked about enterprise development. Enterprise development has been ongoing. They've done a good job. Incubation, awareness, all these things are going on. But again, for you to be at tier 2 and be able to feed into that profit, because one key aspect I keep telling people is that we should also look at that profit retention in this economy. That's what you call capital accumulation. All these big economies have been able to be what they are because they've accumulated capital. And the way they accumulate capital, various forms, imperialism, just taking out plundering, but also they've also done other ways. Through these contracts, you get me? So they come in, bring the money, and ensure the money goes away. Now, for us to be smart, we need to find a way of how do we actually tap into this? So which companies can, at that level of tier 2, which are indigenous, that we think we can prompt to be able to suck into this money? So if you keep $100 million here in this economy today, when all this activity has ended, remember, all this employment will go down. Look at something else. The people have skills and training, and there are no jobs, which happened in the exploration phase, after the exploration. So again, you'll go back to square one. Opportunity came, you didn't size it. But if you return the 100 million through the indigenous farms, this 100 million is going to go to the banking sector. These farms may decide to put 50 million into other investments, which could continue the running the economy. The other 50 million will go to the banking sector, for argument's sake. That is more capital locally sourced. So your cost of money in the economy also goes down because you're relying so much on the foreign capital. So your capital costs start to go down. There's more money for people to borrow and do other things. So to me, my emphasis should be, going back to Betty's side, is how do you help Ugandan farmers on the policy level, not by law? You don't have to use the law. But how do you go on the policy side to help these farms to ensure they are able to be at the tier 2 level where there's more entrapment in terms of what we're talking about right now? And the question is, do you understand what their problems are? I'll tell you for an example. All these things we've mentioned and our colleagues have mentioned, standards, quality management systems, EHS systems, certification, standardization of people, even practices. By the way, like tier 2, if I recall very well, there's cash management, a policy. These companies actually give you even a practice. Do not pay cash to anyone. So at tier 2, you have to, cash will be down at tier 3, beyond even tier 3. You get it? But this is how these companies, they even have best practices. No cash, there's cash management, anti-bribery. Do you give anyone facilitation, favors? Do you give a custom officer some money to help you pass your entry? Things we ordinarily Ugandan would say, this is kawa. Yeah? You get me? Kintu kidogo, nyambanta mbuze vintu vya. You know, you get it? But for these companies, that's already a failure. If they catch you with this, you're out.
Yeah.
You're out. If they find that you've been transacting with the cash, you're out. So some of the things we tend to ignore, but for you to meet all these expectations, for instance, with this long drawn transition, we've run out of money. COVID has also come. There is no fund to help us sustain this. You cannot go to a bank to borrow money to do these things, because the bank can only give you money when you have a contract. Then you can encompass all these things. But without a contract, these things, we must practice them. She mentioned you have to show evidence. You had an EHS meeting, who attended? These things are important. You have to show evidence of so many things that you are doing. You don't just speak, you live what you are saying. So to me, my humble appeal is, if the government has done everything it can do, but you're missing out on one thing, a fund. Put a fund in place. This fund is not to facilitate us buy equipment or assets or ABCD, but to keep us to be able to meet the cost of keeping. These things are expensive. To certify your crane is $15,000. Now, for instance, giving my example, I have another $20,000 spend coming up to certify a few equipment going to do a job of $20,000. But the only way it would make sense for me is that if there was a repetitive
business
action of that job. But now, it's not repetitive, but I have to spend to stay in the game. But I'm out of pocket. But if government could help us, put for us a fund through the enterprise development, that would help us to access money on good terms, on better terms, to be able to keep us meeting the expenses. That will help us upgrade, that will help us meet the standards. Even these little farms you're talking about here, these things are not very hard, as she said, but they require money. They require resources. So we need to find a way of ensuring that people can access money on concessional terms to be able to keep the fire burning and to be able to participate. Prompt all those farms that are at that higher level, look out for them, look at what they require, be able to see how you can support them, because these are the farms which are going to help you retain. It's like you're gathering water. If you have a basin, you'll gather a basin full. If you have a drum, you'll gather a drum full. So where is the appetite? You need to remember, if we are talking about retention of value, I think the surest way is to to accumulate the capital. That is, for me, is the most key thing.
Thank you, Jeff. I think from his submission, it is clear that, yes, we have done very well on what value can be retained in terms of employment, in terms of the companies that are doing work, but without also taking into consideration the ownership question of who owns these companies. Because as he rightly says, is that this profit needs to stay in country. It's not just a matter of doing business, but we need to keep the profit here because it will be reinvested in other things that not necessarily have to be oil and gas. And then the second point he raises is the point around the fund. I know there's the National Content Committee, which is working around that. But I think in Namibia, they have a model which is, I think, some part of what he's trying to put across. I think for every contract that is awarded, they removed 1%, which goes into a fund that goes into training and skilling Namibians to be able to partake and to also support enterprise development. And that fund is huge. I think by last count was about 80 or something million dollars. And they have not yet started producing any barrel of oil. But from all the contracts, all the way from the concessions, exploration, whatever it is that goes out, 1% goes into the fund, and that money then comes back to support indigenous Namibians and enterprises to move up their capability and competencies. So, which then brings me back to Betty. In terms of what Jeff has just put across, how are you supporting Ugandan, and this time I will say Ugandan-owned businesses, to be able to partake some of these opportunities? Because clearly there is an advantage in retaining most of this profit, besides all the value that it will create. But you need to retain the profit so it can go into other sectors of the economy. Is there a way that the government could probably assist in trying to move up their competencies and prepare them for making sure that they can be able to benefit? And it's not unique here. You've seen Ford being bailed out by the US government, and all these other big companies. They have been supported by the governments to make sure that they continue to drive the agenda of the country.
Okay, thank you, Aggrey. Very quickly on the fund, I think like you've said, Ministry of Energy is working around to see the establishment of this fund. And I can tell you that the establishment of this fund is benchmarked on a number of countries that have, including Namibia, like you're saying, Nigeria, and a number of companies that, a number of countries that have set up this fund. I completely agree with Jeff that we need to have this in place, given the fact that these are capital-intensive projects that we are talking about, but also the need for continuity given the up and down movements that we are seeing in the sector. That is something that is being discussed on the content and what needs to go into the fund. All this is being considered, even up to thinking about maybe equipment. So all those are being discussed, and we are hopeful that it can be concluded. Then on the aspect of value addition, specifically, what can we do? The contracts are going to go tier 2 and even below. I think there is a lot of work that is done within the different institutions and doesn't come into the public domain. But I'm only going to talk about the cost management that we do as part of our regulation. We do receive these procurement proposals, plans from the IOCs, and also contracting strategies. I can tell you today that PAU is aware of the 15 billion US dollars that is going to be invested up to the slight dots in terms of the breakdown of the activities. And this is where I want to first of all touch. When we talk about, well, down there is no visibility and maybe a lot of value will go unnoticed, we go up to the level of understanding, not only coming up to say this is the block, 15 billion will be spent. We know the specific activities that will go, the operations that will go into this, and the amount of money that aggregates to the 15 billion. So that now takes us to the part of national participation that PAU regulates. Having broken down as part of the FEED studies or the definition studies of the sector, breaking down to say that the EPC contractor is going to come here, he will need to construct this, this, and the other. What are those specific activities? Then on the side of the national content, now we come up with the capacity that we are aware of. The legal framework gives us 3 levels, where priority should be given to a Ugandan, where we go into a joint venture in case that capacity is not up to the level desired, and where we have an international company. But even at that level, we talk about the aspect of subcontracting. So for us to be able to adequately support in optimizing value retention in the country, we go down to these services. These companies, all those services, when the EPC activities begin, it is not going to be that this is a block, we are now beginning, let's go. They still have to go through the normal approval processes of a work program on an annual basis. So they need to indicate to us that this is what we are going to do, these are the services. And through our national content regulation and monitoring, we get down to say, why should this service be provided by an international firm and not a Ugandan company? And that is the process that we engage in to try and make sure that the value is captured at every level. Even as we move to the level of the work program, we move from the level of the procurement plan. We have another line where the IOCs have to go through the procurement processes. They submit the outcome of the procurement process that PAU interrogates to see how it was done before a recommendation to award is given. I can tell you that we have had cases where PAU said, we do not agree with this because we believe there are companies that can do this work. And the companies have indeed gone back, and we've seen Ugandan companies supply. So I just want to give comfort to the suppliers and all Ugandans that We have visibility on every single cost that goes in this sector. Peter, I think, is best placed to tell you how our regime works. We are looking at a cost recoverable regime where you spend, we take stock of what you've spent, and then at a later date, we will see how to. So for us to be able to take stock of this, we look at every cost that is incurred, the operations that go in there, and that is where we are going to make sure that we optimize the value. That is something that happens within PAU. It never comes to the public domain. But that is where we sit and we indulge with these, we involve with these companies and tell them, look here, this is not something that can happen. We have seen, we have so many examples of cases where the IOCs have come up to say this service can't be supplied. We say, why? Look at the National Supplier Database. Okay, if the firm can't supply, how about a joint venture? Did you try to go into a joint venture? So as a result of that, we are seeing a lot of value coming down. So it is not that our interface is only at IOC level. We also have a mechanism that can arrest the smallest cost down there. And in that, we'll be able to retain more value as a country.
Thank you, Betty. Before we take a break, we will be coming back again with Jackie to speak to us about the importance of HSE and how we can continuously work on compliance to make sure that we reduce on risks and accidents, because it's very expensive in oil and gas to have major risks because people take care of assets which have huge values. For example, even food safety is that if a camp has 3,000, 5,000 people and there's a small food poisoning and you have to shut it down, they are losing probably over $2-3 million per day from non-activity. So she will come to tell us why it's important and how we can continuously track this progress to make sure that we don't fail during implementation. We'll take a break now and we'll return for our last segment.
The Uganda Chamber of Mines and Petroleum is a not-for-profit member-based organization that was founded in March 2010. The Chamber's purpose is to be the coordinating and facilitating center for information.
Welcome back to the last phase of our show. And when we broke off, we were speaking about the importance of standards and why companies need to raise their standards and make sure that they can continuously track them, meet the targets for us to be able to implement whatever contract or opportunity we could have, because lack of that or short of that, it has huge dire consequences on projects and can actually cause companies to fold. So I hand over to Jackie to give us briefly her experience and guidance on why standards are important and how we can continuously track them.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, we believe that all accidents are preventable. You know, as safety professionals or practitioners, that's what we believe. So everything that we do, we take a proactive approach. We try to prevent these accidents from happening, you know, in the first case. So when you look at the oil and gas industry, for example, an oil spill, you know, it's a very big, you know, impact on the environment, on the communities around, and it may start as an oil spill and then end up in an explosion. So the impact is really big. Also, the chemicals that are used in oil and gas, some of them have short-term health effects, some of them have long-term health effects like cancer and everything else. So constantly we try to assess, you know, what could go wrong, who might be harmed, how, and put measures in place to prevent, you know, these incidents from happening. When you do have incidents, it interrupts the operations, which means, you know, the project has to stop, and when projects delay, again, there are repercussions because it costs money, And, you know, the reputation is damaged. So it is very, very crucial that we do put systems in place, especially for health and safety. How do we track these? At the start of every contract, there are targets and KPIs that are given out to the contractor, and these are agreed upon between the client and the contractor. This is because you are delivering this contract on behalf of the client. So these targets and KPIs tie into the client's own targets and KPIs. So you will sign a contract and you will agree to these targets that you will conduct HSC inspections, that you will have regular, you know, drills. You're trying to manage these big risks that have been identified in the activities that you're carrying out. But what happens is, you know, people sign and go to work and they actually do not comply to the targets that, you know, they signed to meeting. So you just work and you focus on delivering the project within timelines, within the given deadline, and forget about health and safety altogether, which puts everybody else at risk. So what happens is the clients do have regular contract review meetings. They'll see how you're doing vis-a-vis what you signed up to do, and they'll record all their findings. Your contract may be suspended, it may be cancelled, or the next time you go back to renew your contract, you know, they'll bring out all the times you failed to meet the given target. So you will not, you know, have your contract renewed, or you will not get a new contract given. So it's really, really important that when people sign these contracts and take them on, and you sign to abide to all the requirements, please make sure that you stick to them. It's not in parallel to the operations, it's embedded in what you do. And please make sure that you're consistent and you maintain records. It is very important, and it is to make sure that we save a life, we save the environment. Much as we do all these, still things go wrong. So when we do get accidents, much as we minimize the chances of it happening, you need to investigate these accidents, get to the root causes of them. Find out, because you already have a system in place. Where is the system failing us? Where are controls lacking? Where are they inadequate? And then put measures in place to prevent it from reoccurring. So it's very, very important that you stick to the standards. In the long run, they save you money. If you think safety is expensive, try an accident.
Hey, thank you, Jackie. You've heard it from the professional. It's very important that we keep continuously managing all these risks and making sure that when we have an opportunity, we can deliver on it. Because if a Ugandan company fails at one job, it is a bad brand to the rest of the Ugandan entities. So whoever has the opportunity to execute a contract must be able to execute it well, because you become the ambassador to all the other Ugandan entities, and you give confidence to contractors that we can actually be able to deliver if given the opportunity. This brings me back to Peter, and on a macro level, to help the public understand how government retains revenue from the PSA structure, what is expected annually from these reserves of ours, and probably where is the money going to be spent. Because then people can be able to appreciate that this opportunity is actually as massive as we've tried to spotlight it.
Thank you, Aggrey. And I think let me start with what we call the upstream. The upstream is exploration, development, and production of crude oil or gas. For now, let's focus on crude oil. So the regime that we run, that is embedded in our constitution, in our law, is what we call the production sharing agreements, also system. What basically means is that an international oil company or an oil company comes here, it enters an agreement with government, it's given a license, and it sinks its money in exploration. If it doesn't find any crude oil, it loses. If it finds crude oil and produces it, then it shares with the government, the crude in terms of barrels. There are certain payments the companies will make, like signature bonuses and others, but those are small components of payments. In Uganda, we've been fortunate to get a lot of taxes from these projects before production of oil. I think we've collected upwards of $1 billion in taxes and other fees before the first barrel of crude oil is extracted. But when crude is extracted under our PSAs, the government takes what, the first take of government is what we call the royalty. This royalty is taken off the gross amount of crude produced. And in Uganda, it's up to 12.5% of the gross production. And after that, then the companies do recover their costs. But the cost recovery is limited in each year. So after that, then we have the remaining crude is shared between the government and the oil companies in what we call profit oil sharing. And in this component, the government takes a higher percentage, much higher than the oil companies. And basically, I think to put it into perspective, our analysis, commercial analysis as Uganda National Company, based on an assumption of a price, an average price for crude of $50, is that Uganda as a government, from royalty, from profit oil, and from these elements of its stake, what we call fiscal instruments, will receive upwards of $40 billion in total revenue, just from that share. And just to emphasize that the government will have a higher take, as it is globally, really. And so that money is structured in the Public Finance Management Act to be managed in the Petroleum Fund. The Petroleum Fund is not part of the government consolidated fund where we get the usual government spending in the year. So all this money will be collected through sale of crude, which UNOC will do. And that money is then sent to the Petroleum Fund. And out of the Petroleum Fund, the money can be used for two functions. One, for infrastructure development through an appropriation that is supervised by Parliament. And then whatever is not put into infrastructure, which I believe will be the greater percentage, is put into investment for future generations in very low-risk investments that have a level of return. So that's how the revenue will be received and managed in the Petroleum Fund. Now going to, that is upstream. Now going to the midstream segment of the sector, you have a refinery that government will have equity in through Uganda National Company and will hold 40% of that project company. So the revenues from that will definitely accrue to the government through UNOC as dividends, and those will come to the government as well. I do not want to speculate a number around it, but because the project is really still at front-end engineering and design. But the initial numbers we're looking at is that this project will be highly profitable, the refinery, because of its positioning and certain fiscal instruments that structure that enable it to be profitable. So we'll be looking at a rate of return upwards of 17%. And that basically means government will get significant revenue out of this refinery as a shareholder. Then in the pipeline, we are going to hold 15%. So the government will hold 15% through UNOC. And we know the pipeline is really structured to transport the crude. So we want to retain value in the upstream sector. So the profitability of the pipeline is not as high as, say, the refinery that I have mentioned. But still, we'll get profits. And that 15% investment is going to definitely be rewarded. And the government will take that benefit through dividends that UNOC will issue. So that is, I think, what I see. But beyond that, you have the Kaware Industrial Park, which I talked about, that is going to really spur industrialization into petrochemical industries and make us an export hub for some of these products that the region is importing. And that will have much more than just revenue directed to government. It will have a macroeconomic impact on the economy. And I think that's what we need, and that's what we need to ensure that the country moves forward. So in brief, that is this revenue structure. And I think the management structure of the revenue as embedded in our law is tested, it is benchmarked, and it should be strong enough to ensure that we have value out of this resource.
Thank you very much, Peter. So for all those who thought that we are only speaking about retention from goods and services, but also at a much higher level, the government has provided for retention from the proceeds of the crude, and where it will go. I would like to come to Jeff. He has spoken about the financial challenges of private sector, obviously between exploration and the next phase that we are going through. But I would like to hear from him, from his experience from exploration. What are those contract terms that he feels probably need to change going forward for the next phase? And what lessons can he share with those who are intending to enter the sector in this phase? So that probably maybe the authority, the regulator, can be able to pick a couple of concerns, but even those who are intending to join this sector can learn from a person who, at the peak, probably about $30 million of work. Jeff.
So it's a very difficult one because you're putting me in a position to be the one, like I'm the issue of the contract, so that we're on the receiving side. But anyway, for sure, these contracts are quite complicated, especially depending on the level of which you're being contracted. Are you a tier 1, are you a tier 2? I, for one, know an instance, because when they are bidding, they even give you the contract as part of the appendices to look through and see whether you're happy with the contract. And when the time comes for contract talks, you should be aware of the nature of contract you're going to be focusing on. I know of an instance where one bidder, because of the contract being so skewed to with more of the risk on their part, some of these international players understand these things. They walked away. They told us, Jeff, we will not be part of this because our board feels this is very risky. So to answer your question, the issue of the contract knows what they're trying to achieve when they issue a contract. And obviously, as you know, a contract has various components. One, the nature of relationship. The other one, how will you relate? The other aspects will be the various elements of risk and ABCD being addressed. And these contracts are not small documents. They actually need professional people to go through them, especially, again, depending on what level of tier you're going to engage. If you're at the bottom, you may just get a purchase order, you may get, things may be simple, yeah? But if you're going to be at the second tier, first tier, you may get a booklet of documents which you need a seasoned lawyer in town to come and take you through. And sometimes not all lawyers can understand commercial aspects. So they may have an idea, but again, you need a specialty in that case. So my advice would be, you get a contract, study it, get someone to help you interpret it. There are certain things these companies may just put in for the sake of seeing whether you're observant what's going on. And rightfully or fairly so, because they are also, they're entities, they're trying to do what they do best. So if you don't pay attention, you find you have, at a later point, is this what I signed? Yes, you signed it, boss. And you have nothing to do. So pay attention to the detail in the contract. They are not just papers to look at. They have a lot of meaning, and to an extent, you'll be able to mend the contract fairly to your favor, but it's always a difficult negotiation. I've been in those negotiations. You have to just to know what is your bottom line and try and see if you can mitigate. Sometimes the terms are not easier to change. Sometimes they are flexible. And if you look at this project, it's quite risky. So I think people are all trying to ensure that they pass on risk as much as they can.
Thank you, Jeff. My last question then will go to Betty. Based on what Jeff has just highlighted, what mechanisms does the regulator have to try and support unfair contract terms, especially to Ugandan contractors, and even at employment level, in terms of succession planning? How do you support Ugandans to actually be at certain management levels that will give more value and better work experience for them as a regulator? In 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. On the part of the contracts and the contract terms, I think going back to the processes that we go through, at the time when we receive the requests to award, we are looking at exactly what has come out of the process to make sure that at least everything has been fair in terms of the evaluation on the commercial, the technical, national content, and environment aspects. That is what we are looking at. There is a limit to the level of information that the companies submit. And for contracts of a certain magnitude, the companies go ahead to submit the contracts. And what we can say here is that we can control the technical aspects that go into a certain aspect, a certain, contract. And then there are areas that we think should be in the hands of the clients. Because I am going to sign a contract with the IOC. Indeed, whereas there is a regulator that is supposed to make sure that I'm in the area of environment studies and therefore I have the capacity and I deserve to get that contract. Our expectation, just like Jeff has said, is to take caution before we sign off these contracts. Because if a contractor, for example, we've had cases where someone has signed a contract that says termination will be at, there is a clause on termination, but there is nothing like a conditions that will trigger the termination. So in such a case, as a client, as a Ugandan company, if you go ahead and endorse that contract and it starts working, at a time of termination, we get back to the contract and say what was the contract saying. So if we find such problems, it becomes very hard for PAU to come in at that level. But generally, and to help out the situation, our directorate in charge of legal is undertaking a process of looking at these contracts to look at the different clauses that seem to be standard. It is true the terms continue differing depending on the nature of the contract, but then there are other standards. So on the part, majorly on the part of termination, that is where we've been having issues. Someone has gone in a Ugandan company, I don't know whether it's excitement, for lack of a better word, someone goes ahead and signs the contract. And we start running the contract. Then along the way, it's terminated. Someone comes and says, you see what? Then you say, okay, let's look at the contract. What were the conditions? All we need to do here is, whereas PAU is trying to ensure that we have all fairness in the process, as the Ugandan companies that are coming into this process, it squarely falls on us. What are you signing? What are these terms? Because the moment you go into that obligation, that is now an obligation between two parties. You are a third party in this. Our coming in to help at that level becomes very hard. So what we can commit to is to ensure that every time we realize such things, we bring it out to the IOCs, and they have been able to improve different provisions within the contracts. But the companies signing these contracts should also take that extra caution to involve the different parties to look at what the terms are. Sometimes they are not easy to understand. You might read and think, well, this is it. And like Jeff is saying, they'll put in a statement and maybe you don't know what it means. So it is only helpful to you as a firm to engage a professional to help you interpret what it is. So basically, we have a role to play, but also as the clients going into this, I don't see the need to panic. You don't have to. The moment the process is concluded and you're asked to sign, you have all, the right in this contract to make sure that you read and get it, and be very clear on what you're signing. So we shouldn't rush. Let's try and understand what we are committing to.
Thank you very much. We come to the end of our show today. Thank you, such a super panel. As you can see, this is also national content because the wealth and knowledge that they have disseminated to the public is quite enormous, and they have learned from the industry, which is nascent. So we are calling upon you and you out there as a clarion call, that you get interested in this sector, because when history looks back, it will know that you stood where duty and responsibility asked you to, and you made a contribution to your country. Good evening.